Hi, I'm Doyle.
And I'm Jordan, and I've got some things to say. And today's a little different because we don't have video here. Doyle and I are actually physically co-located today, which is interesting turn of events. Hopefully, we can get some video set up for some of the future ones while I'm here. But we were trying to come up with the topic to talk about today. Normally, it's kind of a off the cuff sort of thing that we come up with the topic. It's what are we thinking about? What's going on out in the world, and how is that making us think about things? How does that raise up our personal philosophies? There's a lot of I think both Doyle and I, and I'll take the baton to speak for you and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we both think about things a lot in a critical way of, what are we doing with the things we're trying to achieve, but also what is going on in the world? Why are those things going on in the world? What does it mean for us individually? What does it mean for society? Not that we're trying to change society, that we're just trying to understand the implications of certain things, because if we don't understand if we're walking down the path and we don't understand where that path is going, then we can't know if we're going to end up where we want to be. And so you have to think about things along the entire way to make sure that you end up where you're going to be, so you can course correct or whatever. And so, and we, like I said, it's pretty much impromptu, us coming up with topics. Sometimes we plan ahead of time if we have like a multi-part thing. But so we talk a little bit before the podcast to figure out what we're going to talk about. We were doing that today, and it really led us to some concerns of some things we were trying to really avoid, I think, with the podcast by intent, and it's seeming that less and less that can be the case. And so we figured that today we'll just have a conversation about our conversations and kind of see where that takes us, as far as, what we'd hope to get from these conversations, what we hope to maybe not necessarily do with these conversations, and where we find ourselves, and where, reassessing that path. Like I said, are we going to end up where we want to be with the podcast? Let's think about it in that same manner, and apply that sort of critical thinking approach to life to this podcast. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So that's a long, drawn out, windy intro, as I normally tend to get when I speak. So I'll really just drive to the heart of the matter of what prompted this conversation today for the podcast, and that is our initial desire when we started this last year to avoid becoming too political. So if you go and listen to our first few episodes, they were already pretty political, but I think that we did a decent enough job at presenting the basically current events that we were talking about then in a light that was philosophical in nature, where we tried to indicate why we felt the way we felt about those events, and what in our personal philosophies had us, kind of emotionally charged about it. And make no mistake, that's why we started this podcast, or at least from my perspective, is because we were pretty emotionally charged about those issues, which are still ongoing for the most part, and are being exacerbated by certain actors. And so the whole idea of trying to avoid it becoming too political was because, and I can only speak for myself, why I wanted this is because I felt that I did not want to be one of those actors that contributed to the division, that contributed to the friction, that contributed to all of that. But for me, again, I'm just purely speaking my perspective, and Doyle, I hope that you'll give me the pleasure of your perspective too. It has been frustrating over this past year how much taking that approach of self-censorship, in a way of not being political, and again, I don't want to get political, but how that there's a very fine line there between speaking the truth and calling out things that need to be called out, and just capitulating, right? And at what point do you feel that you're just capitulating versus trying to keep the situation on an even keel and focus on the real problems at hand, which I want to always focus on the real problems at hand, whether it's a political discussion or not. But I feel that we've come to a point where our politics in our country, maybe even our world, but certainly our country of the United States, is so seems to be increasingly become emotionally charged and less based on rationale and reason. That, I mean, you have to say something. And I think that that's the struggle that we find that we're engaging with right now, that, look, some things are just absolutely ludicrous, and you have to point them out and talk about them. So I think that if we were to engage in any kind of political discussions here, I think that we have to be extremely diligent in our focus and intent at trying to identify the problems, identify the exacerbators to those problems, and identify most importantly, the potential resolutions to those problems. Because I think that this is my biggest problem with the political arena generally, is that there's a lot of complaining, a lot of fussing, a lot of yelling, a lot of fighting, even if it's just verbal sparring going on, and there's very little, and I mean very little, focus on how do we address the issues that we find. People love to list issues all day long, but people hate it when they have to get their hands dirty and figure out how to correct those things, because it is our responsibility to correct those things. It is no one else's. And so that was my real concern about getting political, is because I know my own nature, and I know how easy it is for me to get frustrated, how easy it is for me to get incensed and get that fiery emotion running inside of me. And I know that whenever that happens, it becomes that barrier to reason. It becomes that barrier to clear, critical thinking about the problems at hand. And it becomes so easy to point fingers. It becomes so easy to blame. And I just want to very much avoid that, because I don't think that that's productive at all. And in fact, I think that not only is that counterproductive, it is also, I think, part of the plan of some nefarious actors in all of this to get people that riled up, to divide and conquer in that way. And I don't want to play into their hands. So it's a very, again, fine line to walk if we were to have such discussions. That's kind of, I guess, an overview of my perspective on it, Doyle. So what do you think about all that?
Ditto. I won't be that contrite. To go back to your point and your question about, we've attempted to avoid purely political conversations, right? And what we've struggled with, and I think I've struggled with, and I think you probably have too, is that almost everything that we talk about, because it typically triggers some thought, emotion within us, finds its way leaning toward the political conversations. And as you say, we're not looking to, that's not what we wanted to do here. We didn't want to be another, voice that's on an extreme, right? We wanted to be voices for people that are everyday people, right? That have thoughts like us, that they are tired of the angst and the anger and the fighting that's continually going on, and want to find ways to compromise where we can compromise. In those areas where we can't compromise, find ways to tolerate, right? And because we don't all have to think and be and feel the same, right? That's the thing. And I think my personal philosophy about politics is I can like you, I can care deeply about you, I can love you and still disagree with your politics.
Sure.
Right? And I want people to return that same degree of respect back. But I think we're in an environment right now where on both ends, and it is treated as though politics are binary, and they're not.
Right.
You're either this or you're that, and that's why some of the things that one of the topics that I think we talked about previously was silence is complicity, or I can't remember the exact phrase.
I think you made a video on that.
Yeah. And I disagree with that. Just because I don't speak up against something does not mean I support it.
Correct.
And just because I speak up against it doesn't mean I won't find a way to work within things. But I think individually we're entitled to our personal feelings. And
I think there's another important factor in that matrix that people don't think about too. Just because I speak out against something, that doesn't mean that I agree with everybody who speaks out against that.
Exactly.
That's a big problem
Yes.
that we run into these days where like, you know, and it's one of the biggest reasons I don't like the idea of speaking publicly politically, because I know that people will be like, oh, you're just like X. Oh, you're just like Z. No, I'm not. I am absolutely not. And I don't agree with that. Probably don't agree with that person. Might not agree with that person. Maybe some I do, but I don't agree with them by virtue of us having that same position on that issue.
And that's sort of the binary thing that happens, that people go, oh, you're automatically A or B or C or whatever.
Right.
And A or B, not C if it's just trying
well,
to.
I mean, finite multifactor.
Right.
Or whatever.
But the reality is we all live on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Right. And there are many things that we agree about, but what we tend to I think we see now is that people are more focused on what they disagree about.
Correct.
And that's causing, you know, the actions and the acting and the belief that we don't agree on anything, because look at all these things we disagree about. And I think that's what's missing from the political realm right now. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons that I think that's the case, and some you mentioned, but I think some of it is that it feeds on itself, right?
Yes.
The actors, the politicians, and you've seen this, and we've all seen this. They, as soon as they get elected, they may have great platforms and they may have great, you know, approaches and philosophies and goals and objectives and things they want to accomplish, you know, with a pure heart, a lot of them. But immediately after they get elected, the first thing they start doing is planning to get reelected.
Right.
And rather than focusing all of their energy on serving, and I had the privilege of meeting a couple of candidates for our local House of Representative race a couple of years ago. Actually, it was 3 of them that were running. And I got to meet them. And one of them I had met previously, and I had known him through some other contacts that I'd had. And I asked him, I said, he said, what can I do for you? You know, sort of playing the politician role, because he had been a lifetime politician, had served in elected positions for years, you know, locally and what all. And I told him, I said, do this one thing. I said, if you get elected, be a statesman, not a politician. And I truly meant that with all my heart. We need more statesmen. We need more people that are willing to go and to endeavor for the good of the greater good rather than their personal good. And that's to me is what's so horrific about it. They've lost, too many people have lost sight of that. And there are voices, and there are some people on both sides of the aisle that I think have pure hearts and genuine goals and objectives, but they get caught up in the machinery.
Of course.
And the machinery does not permit that to be a position of strength or a voice to be heard.
So a couple things I want to say to what you've said recently, because like I think we're really rapidly approaching a point where you and I have, I think, a pretty stark disagreement. And I want to start with something that I'm pretty sure we do agree on, because I want to help that illustrate why I have the position that I do. And we've gotten political, so here we are. But when you talk about when someone gets elected, their first thing isn't how can they help their constituency, basically. It's how can they get reelected. I a little bit disagree with that, and I'll tell you why, because I think you do agree with what I think. I think that they absolutely 100% immediately go to work to help their constituency. I think we just don't agree on what their constituency actually is. The constituency is not the people in the district or whatever that they represent. The constituency is the people who donated to their campaign, the people who put them out in the light, people who push them forward, all of the special interests, so we'll use that as a generalizing term, that got them elected. Well, they want their payback for that. And so they get right to work doing that, absolutely, diligently. It's just that it's always those people that get served, and it's very rarely and usually only coincidentally or incidentally when it bumps up against the same interests of those special interests, that the actual constituency, the people in those districts, get, you know, served in that way as well. And I think that is also the same thing as them trying to get reelected. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's that. But then also I want to talk about your point of needing a statesman. I think from the idea of the system that we have, that's the only way that it will work. I think, though, that it is unrealistic to think that human nature will allow that many people from that disparate of places with that many different cultures, because the United States is not a monoculture, and if anybody tries to claim that it is, has never been anywhere outside their hometown. I mean, you have to go very short distance from pretty much anywhere in the country to understand that the United States is not a monoculture. And because of that, there are some deeply conflicting values across this country that perhaps we could compromise on, but I think that any such compromise would amount to non-action or non-coverage or whatever you want to say. It basically may amount to literally nothing happening, or an undoing of anything that has happened, because the only compromise is that, well, let's just not do this because you want it, I don't, etc. You know, that in the simplest formulation. But even then, is that a compromise? Because really what happens if you want something and I don't want something, the compromise we get something that just doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And the problem is then you create monsters. And that's what our government has been in the habit of doing for, almost forever, but certainly the past century, probably even longer than that. And so that's my real problem with this, is that I feel that the idea that this system even works at the scale that we're talking about is taking a slightly rose-colored glasses view of the system itself. And I don't say this to say that, we need no system, although that is my position, and I don't know if I've ever made it that directly clear, is that I am for, privatization of everything, right? Because I have a strong perspective that all of the ills that everyone wants to pin on, large business, that everyone wants to pin on, the ills that people want to pin on government, the ills that people want to pin on people who are obstinate voters or whatever, all spring from the fact that there's something to be upset about, right? If the government's there, then there's something to be upset about. If it's not there, well, then what? It's like that's the ultimate way to take self-responsibility, is to not say that, well, this organization should do it for me. And then people want to say, well, I'm taxed, so basically it's just like a company that I'm paying to do it for me. Okay, well then, if that's the case, then why can't I just pick a different one? That's if that's how you really feel about it, then my position is, let's just have a plethora of companies offering this that you can pay your quote unquote tax to, and then get the services, and then you can go to whoever's giving you the best service for the best money for the least amount of quote unquote tax. That's the way I think things should be. But everyone, whenever you talk to, well, not everyone, many people, when you talk to them about that perspective, they think it's so radical and it's unworkable, and it's like, it's literally the same thing that we do right now. In every other facet of life, except for the things that government provides in a monopolistic fashion.
Well, there's a great example of how that could work and should work. And that's the Postal System, United States Postal Service, right? Because the Postmaster General just this week came out and said they're on a death spiral.
Well, I mean, yeah, they are
financially.
It's like they say that like every other month or something.
Understand, but it's kind of like the old phrase, and I used a lot in the corporate. I learned and used a lot in the corporate world as a way to manage workload. Right? Is you can do a death march once, then you die. Yeah. Well, the thing is with the Postal Service, it's being subsidized by the federal government. By the people of the United States because of their taxes, and then you have organizations like, Federal Express, FedEx, and UPS, and there's others, DHL, and other, and even now
regional carriers.
Even now, the Ubers and things like that are getting into deliveries of sorts.
Well, then businesses that are getting efficient enough to do it themselves, like Amazon.
Right. Amazon, yeah, right.
Not to say that there isn't a lot to critique on all these companies as well, but it's like, look at the service you get for the money that you pay, which one's giving you the best value.
So let me ask you a question. You get a lot of packages in the mail, I suspect.
Yeah.
Any of them come from the Postal Service?
Actually, so only to the extent that, I would say a very, 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 very small percentage will come like priority mail. Very small percentage. But beyond that, almost all of them are coming through some sort of partner service with UPS or FedEx even, right? I think
FedEx? I didn't know FedEx had a relationship.
Yeah, so UPS is like called Mail Innovations, and FedEx is called like Custom Solutions. No, not Custom Solutions, their own thing. I don't know, but FedEx has one too where they do it.
Sort of the last mile kind of thing in certain categories.
Right? Yeah, last mile meaning that UPS or FedEx carries it most of the way, and then they drop it off at the post office, and then USPS takes it to your door.
Right. They do bulk items.
Right.
But that's a prime example of how the inefficiency that is built into a government service. And people go, yeah, but it costs 52 cents for a stamp to mail a letter. No, it doesn't. It costs a lot more than that. That's just what the government subsidizes.
That's why they're always raising postage rates.
Right. And quite frankly, when I think about what we get in the U.S. mail, if it never showed up again, I wouldn't miss much. I mean, there would be certain local bills that get mailed that still are, paper, that aren't digital, but even those are starting to be digitized.
But there's very little reason for all of that. That's the thing.
Most of it's junk.
Correct. Well, I mean, that's the thing is that's one of the biggest revenue sources for USPS is all of the quote-unquote junk mail that they deliver because people pay them to deliver that.
So, I mean, that sort of supports your point. And I'm not sure where you were head. Oh, maybe the point about where we would disagree.
I think the way we would disagree is that I think that potentially we would disagree is that I think that it's unreasonable to think that any organization larger than like a dozen people, if even that large, is going to be able to have a not even a totality but a quorum of statesman character people.
Sure.
To really move things forward.
I think there's an answer to the fundamental, a fundamental support of your point, and that goes. And this is going to get really political, and I don't mean it to be, but the whole the 10th Amendment, if I'm not mistaken, the states' right. Mm-hmm. If the federal government respected that, I think, and allowed states to be more independent and I say allowed. It's crazy to be said. They shouldn't have to be allowed. They are right. And if the federal government respected that, and I get it how they disrespect that is through the taxation and then the supplying of that money back to the states as leverage, right? If you don't,
it's blackmail. Yeah, the states are
is.
Blackmailed into action or inaction,
and so they're addicted to it, right? And they begin to depend on it, and like we've seen this in this pandemic. The whole thing about the states, they want the federal government to bail them out, and they don't want to do what they can do. It appears that they don't take primary accountability to do what needs to be done, and they should be self-sufficient. They should be, and if they're not, then they should take actions to become self-sufficient. I think that's a way to address what you're talking about. And it's still a larger group because states have millions of people, and so that sort of exceeds the small thing. And there's even large variations in cultures and subcultures within states. But I think that would be easier to work toward, acceptable compromises.
Correct. No, I definitely agree with that. I want to expand your identification of the problem because it sounds like, and if I'm mischaracterizing what you just said, please correct me. It sounds like you're saying that basically we find ourselves in this position because of an large scale ignorance or ignorance of the 10th Amendment and states acting independently and states forgetting maybe is a word.
Too.
What's
acting accountably too.
Correct. Because it's just one large pass the buck is what it seems like.
Absolutely. I agreed. It goes back to, I think, a comment you made earlier in this discussion about people looking to someone else to do something for them.
Right.
I think, and that's exactly what the states are doing to a great extent.
So, but I want to flesh out that as being the causal problem or the root problem, because I'm not sure if that's because I think there's two other things that are at play, and that is that I think these two things are more fundamental than the ignorance of the 10th Amendment, because these two things are what have trapped, for lack of a better term, or maybe snared, let's say, the states into this addiction pattern to what the government provides, and that is the gross and ultimately it's going to come down to strict or loose constructionism of the Constitution, but it is gross misinterpretation and misapplication of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and the gross interpretation and misapplication of the General Welfare Clause in the Constitution. So Commerce Clause is the Congress may pass no act regulating the trade, basically interstate trade, right? You can't regulate interstate trade. But there's like this, except for the things that, there's like a little clause on the end of it that's like, they can if it's really necessary. That's a really bad way to say it, because I don't remember the exact phrasing, but they stuff everything under that clause, and basically they let everything be regulated, and to where we do have de facto interstate trade regulation, like wholesale interstate trade regulation. And because of that, they use all of those acts that they pass that way to withhold funds, like you were mentioning. And then Title IX is one of the biggest ones, right? Which is funding for schools, which is a whole nother can of worms to get into. And
one that I want to open up one day.
Because, yeah, no, I'm with you on
because,
that.
I have some
That's fundamental
extremely strong points of view about the educational system today.
Same. And then the General Welfare Clause, and Congress will provide for the general welfare of the population, or whatever. That has really been contorted, because that, as I understand it, a lot of that was intended to be like, anti-famine sort of thing. Like, if people are like starving in the streets, and like literally, well, okay, we'll figure out what we can do. That's like, it's like a cause of last resort sort of thing. And so, like, we have all of this legislation and all of these laws in this country, all these quote unquote laws, acts of Congress, we'll say, that exceed the length of the Constitution millions of times over, like literally millions, maybe billions, but certainly millions of times over, that we have to follow, and nobody knows the law. So thus nobody knows the law.
Right.
And thus everybody's always breaking the law, because you can find a law. And thus we're all in this like, game of, there's a loaded gun with the hammer cocked right at our heads at all times, and so we all have to walk in a straight line, because if not, then we step out of line, then that hammer's gonna hit the bullet. And so there's this really bad thing where, yeah, okay, so all of these acts of Congress, it does a lot of things that a lot of individual people do like, right? We're talking about things like, certainly anything post Woodrow Wilson is just like almost abhorrent on its face, but New Deal stuff, you talk about Great Society stuff, which Great Society is like welfare, and then Social Security and all that. Even into stuff in the 80s where, like, we had like, I don't know if this was 80s, maybe in like 70s, but like expansion of Social Security, and like there was a lot of like antagonistic laws, which I think some have been corrected, but certainly not all, against like private investment.
I want to throw a comment out and interrupt you.
Sure, go ahead.
Social Security is not an entitlement. Proceed.
Okay, sure. Well,
you didn't say that. I just did that as a point to get out there, because it is lumped in with entitlements in lots of conversations. So proceed.
It's not an entitlement program, but it is a program that should be regarded with the same disdain as entitlement programs, in my opinion. The program itself. The problem is it's such a trap, because we've all paid into it as people, who work in this country.
We were made to pay into it. Wasn't it?
Correct. Coercion. All of this is coercion in my perspective. But that, again, we can have another conversation about that. So my point being is that all of these two clauses, the General Welfare Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause, are the things that Congress have used to abuse this country and to put us into basically an extended Stockholm syndrome with the government. And some of us love the abuser and the captor, and some of us still hate the captor. And that's the problem, is that in the whole Stockholm syndrome situation. That's what happens, is that those who are trying to disabuse themselves of their captor get not attacked by the captor, but get attacked by those who love the captor. And that is exactly the kind of situation I think we find ourselves in. So, thus, there's very little desire to exercise 10th Amendment rights. And I think that combined with the last time that actually was attempted, albeit for very bad reasons, I will 100% admit and agree, led us to a civil war that was very terrible.
And it's a shame that more people don't truly understand. Yes, slavery, the issue of slavery was the state's right that was in dispute, but it was the state's right, constitutional difference there that led to that civil war.
Right.
And obviously, I think everyone is or should be glad that slavery was abolished in this country, because totally. it was an abhorrent part of our history,
right,
in this country. But that's what I think people don't know, that out of ignorance. They don't understand the Constitution. And actually, there's an organization that is one of its missions is to make sure that every child gets a copy of the Constitution. And they actually are having nice. adult courses free to teach people what the Constitution says, because it's a very short document.
Oh, yes.
And to your point, Congress has attempted to mutilate the Constitution with all the legislation and the laws they put in place, over the years, trying to clarify, and it didn't. It muddied the circumstances.
So again, and this gets a little bit onto my too far political, but my opinion is that they're not trying to clarify; they're trying to exercise the control.
You're right. But they're doing it by an interpretation, or trying to stay within the bounds of what someone interprets the Constitution, which
Correct.
leads to the Supreme Court issue of how the Supreme Court justices view the Constitution. Are they literal constructionists, or I forget what the other term about more
strict construction or loose construction. Right. Well, I mean, then you have, and the real unfortunate thing is that we have the absolute abhorrent situation like Justice John Marshall, where he actually started the precedent of the Supreme Court judging the constitutionality of acts of Congress. And in doing so, he ushered in this idea that a law-minded person can legally contort the words of the Constitution to cover things that they can make it cover as far as acts of Congress. So basically stretching all of this Constitution, the loose constructionism of allowing the Constitution to, quote unquote, allow for things like Social Security, welfare, all of the Green Deal, the New Deal. Oh my goodness, I'm getting infected with the rhetoric of today. The New Deal legislation. I hope I didn't say Green Deal earlier. I meant New Deal. No. So, and the sad part about this, and this is going back to that education point, is that so few people many people go through the United States education system, but so few of them just learn enough of this stuff to even be able to talk about it.
Sure.
Let alone learn exactly what they're taught, which is usually things that aren't necessarily congruous with the reality of what those pieces of legislation were, what the climate of things was at the time, both politically and socially, and really learn things divorced of those highly illuminating contexts that are critical to understand the reality of those pieces of legislation. And not only that, to understand how deeply those things have affected our society and how our society has evolved since then.
Here's a wormhole. And I think there are some reasons that are very obvious to me that have led to that. The whole thing about the ill education, if you will, of the population over the last few generations regarding government, regarding history, and things, and even social sciences, but based on the fact that in 2 or 3 generations ago, most free time spent by children were not in mindless things. They were in either reading, because that was, books were not as prevalently available as they are today, or at least access to books. I'm talking, back in the early part of the 20th century, probably 4 generations ago now. I'm losing count of time and generations. And so what we're seeing today is with the advent of technology, there are more diversions that are out there, more temptations and diversions that are being partaken by younger and younger kids. So they're choosing what to consume rather than consuming what's been deemed to be put in front of them.
Ooh,
I know where you're going. I know where you're going. It is what they're consuming now is deemed to be put in front of them. It's intentional. They're competing for the minds and eyes and hearts. And well, my point being,
not just that, but I'm also talking like algorithms on platforms where,
right,
like YouTube. I mean, how much is what you see what you chose, and how much of it is what YouTube wants you to see?
Right. But my point being, there are temptations to divert away from things that might have otherwise been. They may have otherwise been exposed to.
But don't ignore also that whoever published those books, whoever decided those books got published,
they were slanted.
So, right. I mean, it's a similar problem, but it's just at a larger scale, I think.
A larger scale and a more rapidly changing.
Sure.
And a stronger force, right?
Okay.
Because, I mean, I don't know about you.
I don't know. I don't know about this because a stronger force. Force isn't what you care about. Pressure is what you care about, right? And so pressure is force over a certain area. When you only have so many options with the same force, that's more pressure. Sure. When you have more options with the same force, then it's less pressure. And I that's really my perspective on it, is that this proliferation isn't in and of itself the problem. The problem is the way that we know how to take advantage of the human mind, and especially the young human mind, and how much we create traps for that. So I think your point still stands, but I think it's because of a little bit of a different reason than what you're talking about.
Sure, and I certainly embrace and accept your explanation of what I was saying, and may have been a little off target, but that was my intent, was
sure, yeah.
that there is more active pressure on to move minds a certain way rather than more. To divert minds in more certain ways rather than in more of a singular way, I suppose.
But here's the thing, though. Correct. I agree with that. Here's the thing. This is also a blessing because
sure.
You have children who are aware enough and have been instructed to be aware enough and are just naturally aware enough to understand that this is trying to manipulate me. And I'm telling you, there are some smart kids that can understand that at a really young age.
Well, and it's because it's not like me. Technology really didn't, individual use of technology didn't really strike until I was already an adult.
Sure.
And now these children, I mean, most of them, before they hit their first birthday, they've touched technology in some fashion.
Right.
So it's more.
When you say technology, you mean like computers, et cetera.
Computers, tablets,
yeah.
Television, cable. When they didn't have cable, it was only in the large cities when I was a kid growing up.
Yeah.
And I didn't live in a large city, so we had the 3 channels that came over the air, 4 channels because one was the public broadcasting. And then so these kids, it is more of a natural way of consuming information, and so they. Some, to your point, are more in tune to what's going on, but there's others that aren't. And my concern and my point is that group that's not aware, I don't know what the size is, but it's probably a majority of people are more susceptible to being led in whatever direction these actors choose.
No doubt.
And that potentially, and this is a more political side. And that potentially is creating, adding to the division that we started off talking about, right? This whole thing about political,
yes,
right? And so that's a logical component of creating and keeping this division in place.
But here's the my point about that. I don't think that is necessarily bad.
Okay.
And I know you may not agree with that.
No, I don't know.
But let me tell you why.
Yeah, I'll hear the rationalization.
Yeah, so I don't think that's necessarily bad for a couple different reasons. One is not one that's going to make you feel any better about this, so I want to get that out of the way first. One is because it helps. It's like, do you know about the Pareto distribution? So this is like 80-20 rule, basically. Right. That for you get 80% of the value with 20% of the effort of something. But it's this is a sort of a distribution that also appears, and Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, but it appears like almost everywhere in life. I mean, it's been found in like reproduction of like bacteria and like reproduction rates with bacteria, but it's also in like specialization in fields, right? And it gets really extreme where like his example he always uses is like if you go into an organization, you'll find that 10% of the people do 90% of the work. But then if you look at that 10% of the people, 10% of those people do 90% of that 10%'s work. And it's fractal like that. And so this kind of division like you're talking about with this accelerated division with like social media, newer technologies, etc., helps push that beyond where it could go before, because kids do that earlier in life and get to extremes, and not just political extremes, but even extremes in things like learning about science, learning about how to do technology, learning about important things that can help humans, right? Learning about business, being an entrepreneur. I mean, you have kids that are younger calling themselves entrepreneur, knowing what the word entrepreneur is, and that's fascinating and amazing and awesome if you ask me.
Sure.
So it's pushing all of those things that way, and so it's helping drive human innovation and human progress in that way. And I think that can be really wonderful. Obviously, it can also be really bad too. But here's where I think the reason why I think that that's not the problem. I think that the problem again is when people go to these extremes. Let's move back into political realm. Let's go into political ideology, and we talk about things like extreme like Marxist views, extreme like fascist views, even extreme social liberal view, or not just social liberal, but like socialism, right? Where there's this, where socialism's a few steps away from communism, because there's some people who identify as a socialist and want socialist policies, but really understand that the ultimate evil of communism is not gonna bring the utopia that it espouses. That's their belief anyway. So there's distinction there. There's also distinction on the right, where you have right-on fascism, but you also have people that really believe in the idea of corporatocracy, right? Where it's important for government and corporations to be in bed together because they help each other thrive. And then there's the extreme, like more where I'm at, which is that government itself is an issue, and we know that we can function without it, and thus we need to find ways to function without it because it's unnecessary monopoly in the market and distorts the free market, etc. And then you have people that say that are against the government and stuff as well, more on the left, because it's against human nature, because there's this. We're always at each other, and we need a way to figure out how to form society around cooperating with each other. And these are people that are, a little bit maybe more toward the communistic bent, but they don't want to use the force of some entity to force it, right? And that's where the real ills of communism come in, is when you use the might of government, you use the might of armies, etc., to force certain ways to happen, or things to happen. So I think that that's ultimately my perspective, is that the real problem with all this, I have no problem with all of these ideologies existing, people following them, whatever. I have a problem with there being some sort of handle and lever of power that can be used to be cranked down upon all of these people to say, you must do it this way. Right. That is ultimately the problem. Having this huge bifurcation or trifurcation or quadrication or whatever of views, even politically, even ideologically, in and of itself isn't bad.
Right.
So this is somewhere I think that I disagree a little bit with Jordan Peterson. I think that it's fine to have purity of ideology. What it's not is to then feel like you must force that ideology on other people.
Right.
That's the distinction that I really wish he would draw. But he knows a lot more about humans than I do psychologically and emotionally. So maybe it's not possible for humans to do that at scale. I don't know. But I really think the real problem, the root of the problem, is the mechanism by which people feel like they can control other people.
And hence, politics creates actors that are fighting to grab the lever.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. By any means necessary.
Oh, for sure.
Because at that point, it's all that. And this goes to the postmodernist idea is that power is all there is, basically. And so that's all that matters is grab the power. Anyway.
Right. Well, it sounds like a good place for us to catch our breath.
Yeah.
We did a lot of running here. I think it's been a great conversation. A lot of points that we can pick up and chase more in detail later. The educational system, we talked about a little bit about that. We talked about the Constitution. We talked about states' rights in the Constitution. We talked about entitlements and Social Security. I mean, there's a whole lot of things on those and even other topics that we broached that I think would be good for us to expand on and continue down this path of, revealing our perspective on how politics is playing into all of these things. And I think you just hit a big nail on the head with that the lever of power. That's what many people are fighting for, right? It's very obvious, and in and of itself, to use your phrase, that's not necessarily doesn't mean it's always bad, but it's always going to be bad for somebody because of that power is going to be forcing things. And if you have the similar beliefs of the person grabbing the lever, then you're happy until someone else grabs it, and then you're unhappy. So that in and of itself means that's not an acceptable and or sustainable mode going forward.
And to tie this back together with my earlier point, the fact that is what motivates humans, that's the incentive, and all of this is a problem of incentives. The fact that is the incentive for people, it means that those who are true statesmen will never be able to thrive, even if they can make it into that system.
Sure.
They will never proliferate and never thrive in that system because a true statesman does not want to grab that lever.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. They are acting. They would be acting in a selfless manner, and by virtue of grabbing that lever, it's selfish just in and of itself.
Correct.
Well, all right, sir. It's a pleasure.
Yes.
Eyeball to eyeball. That's even funner, as they say in the country. And so is good chatting today.
Absolutely. Always enjoy the conversation. This was an especially good one, if you ask me.
I agree.
All right, Dole. Appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you next time.
Later. Bye.
All right. See ya.